Robert Caldwell smirked at me from across the mahogany conference table, while his lawyer-mistress, Victoria Sterling, slid the final divorce papers toward me with those manicured nails. That probably cost more than most people spend on groceries. Sign here, Margaret, she purred, her voice dripping with the smug satisfaction of a woman who'd spent months dismantling someone else's life. The papers gave him everything. Our house, his company, $3 million in assets. Even Max and Bella, our golden retrievers, who'd slept at the foot of our bed for 8 years. And if you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and explain how a 63-year-old woman, who spent 38 years building a life with someone, ended up sitting in a law office watching her entire world get handed to the man who'd been cheating on her with his attorney, no less. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman destroying my marriage was literally a lawyer. It started 6 months ago when I noticed Robert working late more often. Not unusual for the CEO of Caldwell Industries, except these weren't client dinners or board meetings. These were private consultations with Victoria Sterling, ESQ, who specialized in corporate law and apparently stealing husbands. I found out the way most wives do, by accident. Robert's phone buzzed during dinner with a text that made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. It was from V. Sterling. Can't wait to feel you inside me again. Now, I may be in my 60s, but I wasn't born yesterday. I knew exactly what kind of consultation that was when I confronted him. He didn't even bother pretending to be ashamed. Margaret, we've grown apart, he said, like our marriage was a garden he'd forgotten to water. Victoria understands my ambitions. She shares my vision for the company's future. What he meant was, she's young, she's hungry, and she's willing to do things you're not. I understood. Men like Robert always think they're trading up when they hit 65, as if a younger woman can magically reverse the aging process for them too. But here's what really burned me. I helped build Caldwell Industries from a 3-person construction company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. While Robert charmed clients and played golf, I did the books, handled HR, and worked 60-hour weeks without a single stock option or official title. I was the woman behind the curtain, and now the curtain was being yanked back to reveal nothing, at least nothing with my name on it. Victoria did her homework. Since the company was incorporated under Robert's name before our marriage, I had no legal claim. The house purchased with company funds went to him. Our joint accounts? He'd been draining them for months, moving money into offshore accounts that his brilliant attorney somehow made vanish on paper. You'll receive spousal support, Victoria said, like she was being charitable. $1,500 a month. For 2 years, $1,500 a month. For the woman who sacrificed her own career so he could build his empire. I looked at Robert, the man I'd loved since I was 25, and didn't recognize him. Perfectly styled salt-tan pepper hair, custom suit, gold watch catching the afternoon light. He looked successful, powerful, untouchable. When I asked about the missing $3 million from our retirement funds, he just smirked. Sue me, I own this town, Margaret. My lawyers will tie you up in court for years, and you don't have the money to fight me. That's when Victoria leaned in with her grand finale. Of course, there's also the matter of the dogs. Robert has documented their care expenses through the company. Technically, Max and Bella are corporate assets, my dogs. The only living souls in that house who still loved me unconditionally. I signed because I had no choice. I was broke, alone, and apparently in the eyes of the state of Connecticut invisible. But as I walked out of that office, my entire life packed into one small suitcase, I remembered something my grandfather Henry used to say, Maggie girl, sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really made of. I was about to find out exactly what Margaret Caldwell was made of. And Robert was about to be very, very sorry he'd ever underestimated me. The moving truck pulled away from what used to be my house at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I know the exact time because I was sitting in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, watching strangers load my entire life into a vehicle that would drive it to a storage unit I could barely afford. Robert stood in the doorway with Victoria, his arm around her waist, both of them watching my humiliation with the satisfied expressions of people who'd executed a perfect heist. The really twisted part, they were moving her into my house that same weekend. I knew this because our neighbor Helen had texted me about the moving truck she'd seen. Apparently, Victoria was bringing her own furniture. My 38 years of carefully chosen antiques, family photos, and garden that I'd spent decades nurturing were being replaced faster than you could say hostile takeover. I'd been staying at the Motel 6 on Route 9 for 3 days. It was the kind of place where the ice machine was permanently broken, and the continental breakfast consisted of stale donuts and coffee that could strip paint. The manager, a kind woman named Rosa, had given me the senior discount without my asking. 63 and homeless. Apparently, I looked like I needed all the help I could get. The worst part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was Max and Bella. I'd raised those dogs from puppies. Max was the one who'd lie across my feet when I was sick. And Bella was my garden companion, following me around the yard while I planted roses and pulled weeds. They were my children, the only family Robert and I had ever managed to create together. When I tried to see them yesterday, Victoria answered the door wearing my favorite robe, a silk kimono Robert had brought me from a business trip to Japan 15 years ago. "I'm sorry, Margaret," she'd said with fake sympathy, "but the dogs are quite bonded to their new routine. Robert thinks it would be confusing for them to have visits." I could hear Max barking in the background, that excited bark he always made when he heard my voice. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Bella by the sliding door, tail wagging frantically. They knew I was there. "Please," I'd said, hating myself for begging. "Just for an hour?" Victoria's expression hardened. "The divorce agreement is very clear about asset distribution. Perhaps you should have thought about this before you became so difficult during the proceedings." Difficult? Because I dared to ask for half of what I'd helped build. Now sitting outside the motel, I called my sister Joyce in Florida. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. Some stupid argument about mom's china that seemed ridiculous now, Maggie. Joyce's voice was cautious. "Is everything okay?" "Robert left me," I said simply. "For his lawyer, they took everything." There was a long pause. "Jesus Christ, Maggie, are you okay? Where are you?" "Motel 6. I have about $800 left and nowhere to go." "Pack your bag," Joyce said immediately. "I'm booking you a flight to Tampa tonight." "Joyce, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling. Mom always said family sticks together when things get bad." Things look pretty bad. 6 hours later, I was on a plane to Florida with everything I owned fitting into one carry-on bag. The man next to me was reading the Wall Street Journal, and I caught a glimpse of an article about successful companies in Connecticut. Caldwell Industries was featured with a photo of Robert and Victoria at some charity gala. Him in a tuxedo, her in a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly motel bill. The caption read, "Power couple Robert Caldwell and attorney Victoria Sterling at the Governor's Business Excellence Awards Power Couple." They'd made it official in the society pages before I'd even moved out. As the plane lifted off, I pressed my face to the window and watched Connecticut disappear below me. Somewhere down there, Max and Bella were probably looking for me, wondering why I'd abandoned them. Robert was probably pouring champagne to celebrate his new life. Victoria was probably redecorating my kitchen. But here's what none of them knew. Grandfather Henry had taught me something about patience. He used to say, "The best revenge is patience, Maggie girl. Plant your seeds quietly. Water them consistently and wait for harvest time." I had no idea what seeds I was planting or when harvest time might come. All I knew was that 63 wasn't dead. Broke wasn't permanent, and underestimating Margaret Caldwell had always been a mistake. Robert was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Joyce's guest room had lavender walls and a collection of ceramic dolphins. That would have horrified my former interior designer. After 5 days of sleeping on sheets that smelled like fabric softener, and listening to my sister's cats purr outside my door, I was starting to feel almost human again. Almost. Joyce worked as a medical billing specialist from home, which meant she got a front row seat to my daily breakdown routine: coffee, tears, CNN, more tears, lunch, phone calls to lawyers who couldn't help me, and afternoon naps that lasted until dinner. "It wasn't my finest chapter. You need to get out of this room," Joyce announced Friday morning, armed with coffee and what looked like a mission. "We're going to handle Grandpa Henry's paperwork today." Grandfather Henry had died 6 months ago at 94, sharp as a tack until the end. I'd been so consumed with Robert's betrayal that I hadn't even processed the grief. Henry was my favorite person in the world, a Depression-era kid who'd built a small fortune. Through careful investing and sheer stubbornness. "What paperwork?" I asked, tugging on the same jeans I'd worn for 3 days straight. "He left some things for you." "Bank stuff." I've been meaning to handle it, but with everything going on. Joyce handed me a manila envelope that smelled exactly like Grandpa's old house coffee, Old Spice, and furniture polished. Inside were 3 items: Henry's obituary from the Hartford Courant, a key taped to an index card, and a handwritten note in his careful cursive that read, "For Maggie, Farmer Savings Bank, account for 172,891. Started this for you when you were born. Love, Grandpa." I stared at the note, trying to remember if he'd ever mentioned a bank account. "Joyce, did you know about this?" "Know about what?" She looked over my shoulder. "Oh, that old savings account. I think Mom mentioned it once." Grandpa opened accounts for all us grandkids when we were born. Probably has $50 in it by now, $50. Better than nothing, which was exactly what I had. Farmer's Savings Bank was a small brick building squeezed between a nail salon and a sandwich shop in downtown New Haven, the kind of place that still used paper ledgers and had tellers who'd worked there since the Carter administration. I'd like to check on an account, I told the woman behind the counter, a pleasant lady named Dorothy with reading glasses on a chain. My grandfather opened it in 1960. Dorothy typed the number into her computer, frowned, typed it again, then called over her supervisor, a man in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything banking had to offer. Ma'am, the supervisor said, choosing his words carefully, could you repeat that account number? I read it again from Grandpa's note. Both employees exchanged glances. And you said this account was opened in 1960? Dorothy asked. Yes, my grandfather Henry Caldwell opened it when I was born. He said he put $50 in it. The supervisor cleared his throat. Mrs. Caldwell, this account has been accumulating compound interest for 65 years. The original deposit was indeed $50, but with interest compounded monthly at various rates over the decades. He turned the computer screen toward me. I looked at the number. Looked again, blink, third time. 847,19 to 619. That's impossible, I whispered. Compound interest, Dorothy said with a smile. It's like magic, but legal. $847,000. From the $50 my grandfather deposited the year I was born, and then apparently never touched. While I'd been sleeping in motels and begging for scraps from my own divorce, I'd been sitting on a fortune. I started laughing. Not a polite little chuckle, but the deep, soul-level laughter that erupts when the universe pulls off a joke so perfectly timed. You almost have to applaud. Ma'am? The supervisor asked nervously. Are you all right? I'm perfect, I said, wiping tears from my eyes. Absolutely perfect. I'd like to access this account immediately. As Dorothy printed out 65 years of statements showing the slow, steady growth of $50 into a small fortune, I thought of Robert's parting words. Sue me, I own this town. He was about to discover that someone else had just acquired a significant interest in his neighborhood, someone who understood the power of patience, compound interest, and very, very careful planning. Grandfather Henry, wherever you are, I thought, this one's for you. I spent 3 hours at that bank, going through decades of statements with Dorothy and the supervisor, whose name was Frank. Grandfather Henry hadn't just deposited $50 and forgotten about it. He'd been quietly adding small amounts every month for 40 years. $5 here, $10 there, sometimes as much as $25 during good months. Your grandfather was quite the saver, Frank said, showing me statements from the 1980s. Look at this. He never missed a monthly deposit until 2000. What happened in 2000? I asked. According to our records, he moved to Florida. But by then, the account was substantial enough that compound interest alone was adding significant value. Annually, I did the math. From 1960 to 2000, Grandpa had deposited roughly $8,000 total. Interest rates in the 60s and 70s were much higher than today, some years reaching 15% APY. That money had been doubling every 5 to 7 years for 6 decades. Frank, I said carefully, I need to understand something. This money, it's really mine. According to our records, Henry Caldwell named you as the sole beneficiary when he opened the account. Your social security number is on file. You're the only person who can access these funds. I walked out of that bank with a cashier's check for $847,392.16 and a head full of possibilities. Joyce was waiting in the car, scrolling through her phone. So, was it $50? She asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. I handed her the check. She looked at it, blinked, looked again, then promptly started crying. Oh my God, Maggie. Oh my God, you're rich. I'm not rich, I said, though my hands were shaking. But I'm not broke either. That evening, I sat in Joyce's backyard with a glass of wine, researching Caldwell Industries on my laptop. Robert thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my intelligence. Caldwell Industries was privately held, but like many companies, it had taken on investors over the years. According to recent filings, Robert owned 60% of the company directly. The remaining 40% was split between venture capital firms and private investors who'd bought in during the expansion phase. Here's what Robert didn't know. Private investors sell their shares all the time, and some of those shares were currently available through a discrete investment firm that specialized in private equity transactions. I spent the next 2 days making phone calls. Investment firms, lawyers, accountants. I learned about shell corporations, anonymous purchases, and exactly how someone could acquire a significant stake in a private company without current leadership knowing who was buying. By Wednesday, I had a plan. Thomas Mitchell was a lawyer I'd known for 20 years, a contemporary of Robert's who'd always treated me with respect, instead of the condescending patience most of Robert's colleagues showed their wives. When I called him, he agreed to meet at his office in Hartford. Margaret, Thomas said, standing as I entered his conference room. Joyce told me what happened. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Thomas. Be helpful. I need to buy a company. His eyebrows rose. Buy a company? Specifically, I need to acquire shares in Caldwell Industries anonymously. Is that possible? Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me. Margaret, Robert has majority ownership. Even if you bought every available share, you'd never have control. I don't want control, I said. I want a seat at the table. I want voting rights. I want to be in the room when decisions are made about the company I helped build. How many shares are we talking about? I opened my laptop and showed him my research. According to this, approximately 35% of the company's shares have traded hands in the last 5 years. If I could acquire even 20%, that would make me the second largest shareholder. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. This would require setting up a trust, possibly multiple shell corporations to maintain anonymity. It's legal but complex and expensive. How expensive? Based on the company's last valuation, 20% would cost roughly $600,000. I smiled and reached into my purse for the bank statements. Thomas, I said, let me tell you about my grandfather's savings account. An hour later, Thomas was drafting the papers to establish the Meridian Investment Trust, with me as the sole beneficiary and anonymous benefactor. By the end of the week, Meridian would begin purchasing shares in Caldwell Industries through a series of discrete transactions designed to avoid attention. Margaret, Thomas said as I prepared to leave. What exactly are you planning to do with these shares? Nothing dramatic, I said. I just want to attend the quarterly board meeting. As a shareholder, I have that right. And then I thought about Robert's smirk, Victoria's condescension, and my dogs who were probably still looking for me at the sliding door. Then, I'm going to remind my ex-husband that sometimes the woman you underestimate turns out to be the one holding all the cards. The next 3 weeks were the most educational of my life. I learned about proxy votes, shareholder rights, and the fascinating world of corporate governance. I also learned that when you have money and the right lawyer, things that seem impossible become merely expensive. Thomas worked with a network of investment professionals who specialized in discrete transactions. Through a series of purchases spread across multiple firms and dates, the Meridian Investment Trust quietly acquired 23.7% of Caldwell Industries. Not enough to control the company, but more than enough to make Robert's life very interesting. I moved into a small apartment in West Hartford, close enough to monitor my investment but far enough from my old life to stay anonymous. The apartment was nothing special to bedrooms, an updated kitchen, and a small balcony where I could drink my morning coffee and plan my strategy. Because that's what this was, strategy. Not revenge exactly, but justice, a careful, patient correction of the record. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for October 15th. As a shareholder holding more than 20% of the company, I had the right to attend and the right to address the board on any matters affecting company value. I'd been studying Robert's leadership decisions, and I'd found some very interesting patterns. Caldwell Industries had been hemorrhaging money on Victoria's legal fees, not just for their affair, but for elaborate corporate restructuring that seemed designed to benefit Robert personally, while limiting the company's tax obligations. Victoria had been billing the company for strategic consulting at $800 per hour, often for services that seemed suspiciously personal. I'd also discovered that Robert had been using company resources for his new lifestyle with Victoria. The company had purchased a corporate retreat property in the Hamptons that just happened to be where they spent their weekends. Company funds had paid for Victoria's wardrobe, allowance as professional development, even their wine collection was being expensed as client entertainment. None of this was illegal exactly, but it wasn't great for shareholder value. On October 14th, I got my hair done. Nothing dramatic, just a trim and a style that made me look professional rather than like a woman who'd been living in her sister's guest room for a month. I bought a navy blue suit, modest jewelry, and comfortable heels. I wanted to look like money, but old money, established money. The kind of investor who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. That evening, I called Thomas for a final briefing. Remember, he said, you don't need to reveal your identity immediately. As the representative of Meridian Investment Trust, you have every right to be there. Let them wonder who you are and what you want. And if Robert recognizes me, he might. But even if he does, he can't remove you from the meeting. You're there as a shareholder and you own nearly a quarter of his company. I hung up and stood on my balcony looking out at the Hartford skyline. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably having dinner with Victoria, celebrating another successful day of spending company money on their personal life. They had no idea that tomorrow would be different. I thought about Max and Bella, wondering if they still looked for me at the door. I thought about the house where I'd planted roses that would bloom again next spring, for someone else to enjoy. I thought about 38 years of marriage reduced to a $1.500 monthly check and a seat at a motel breakfast bar. But mostly, I thought about grandfather Henry and his $50 investment in my future. He taught me that patience wasn't passive. It was strategic. You wait for the right moment, then you act with precision. Tomorrow was going to be the right moment. The Caldwell Industries board meeting was held on the top floor of a downtown Hartford office building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Connecticut River, and the mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. I arrived at 9:45 a.m. for the 10 a.m. meeting, dressed in my navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio. Thomas had suggested to make me look appropriately corporate. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, checked her list twice when I introduced myself as the representative from Meridian Investment Trust. I don't have you on the list, she said nervously. Call Thomas Mitchell's office, I said calmly. He submitted my credentials yesterday while Ashley made phone calls. I stood by the windows and watched the morning traffic below. I felt remarkably calm for someone about to detonate a bomb. In her ex-husband's perfectly orchestrated new life, Ems? Ashley paused, realizing she didn't have my name. Smith, I said. Margaret Smith, Miss Smith, she said after a moment. Mr. Mitchell's office confirmed your registration. Conference room A is just down the hall. I walked into that conference room like I belonged there because legally I did. The board consisted of 7 people, Robert at the head of the table, Victoria to his right as corporate counsel, and 5 other board members I recognized from various business functions over the years. Robert was reviewing papers and didn't look up when I entered. Victoria glanced at me with the polite disinterest she reserved for people who weren't worth her attention. Good morning, I said, taking a seat near the middle of the table. Margaret Smith, representing Meridian Investment Trust. That's when Robert looked up. His face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally a carefully controlled anger. Margaret, he said slowly. What are you doing here? Representing my client's interests, I replied smoothly. Meridian Investment Trust holds a significant stake in this company. Victoria leaned forward. I'm sorry, what company are you referring to? I smiled at her with the same fake politeness she'd used when she denied me access to my dogs. Caldwell Industries, of course. Meridian Trust purchased 23.7% of outstanding shares over the past month. The silence in that room was beautiful. Robert's face had gone pale. Victoria was frantically typing on her phone, and the other board members were looking between us like spectators at a tennis match. That's impossible, Robert said finally. I would have been notified of any major purchases. Only if the purchases exceeded the notification threshold in a single transaction, I said. Consulting my notes. Multiple smaller purchases through different firms don't require disclosure until the quarterly reporting period, which is today. Victoria's voice was tight. Who exactly is Meridian Investment Trust? I looked directly at her, remembering her red dress in my house, her hands on my husband, her voice telling me the dogs were corporate assets. I said simply. Robert stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. This is unacceptable. You can't just buy your way into my company, our company, I corrected. And actually, I can. Corporate law is quite clear on shareholder rights. As I'm sure your counsel can confirm, all eyes turned to Victoria, who looked like she was frantically trying to remember everything she'd ever learned about securities law. We need to verify the legitimacy of these purchases, of course, I said, sliding a folder across the table. Thomas Mitchell prepared all the documentation. Everything is perfectly legal and properly filed for the next 2 hours. I sat quietly while they scrambled to understand how Margaret Caldwell, the woman they'd dismissed as a powerless ex-wife, had become the second largest shareholder in Robert's company. I listened to them discuss damage control, legal challenges, and whether my purchases could be reversed. They couldn't be. Thomas had done his homework too well. Finally, Robert turned to me with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd been playing chess while his opponent was playing three-dimensional space war. What do you want, Margaret? I smiled and opened my portfolio to the first item on my agenda. Well, Robert, since you asked, I'd like to discuss the company's recent expenditures on legal fees, corporate retreats, and professional development. As a shareholder, I'm concerned about the efficient use of corporate resources. Victoria's face went white. She knew exactly which expenditures I meant, but first, I continued. I think we should address the company's pet policy. I understand Caldwell Industries recently acquired some corporate assets that might be better classified as personal property. Robert's jaw tightened. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious. In fact, I think Max and Bella would be much happier in a more appropriate environment. Don't you? That's when I knew I had won not just the battle but the war. Because Robert was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to be completely, utterly powerless while someone else held all the cards and we were just getting started. The first thing Robert did was call an emergency executive session, which meant asking me to leave the room while the real board members discussed strategy. The second thing he did was make the biggest mistake of his corporate career. Margaret, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't we step outside and discuss this privately? I looked around the table at the 5 other board members, all of whom were watching this family drama unfold, with the fascination of people witnessing a spectacular car accident. Actually, Robert, I'd prefer to keep our discussions transparent. After all, this is a business matter now, not a personal one. His face flushed red. Fine, board members only. I am a board member, I said calmly. With 23.7% ownership, I have automatic voting rights and meeting participation privileges. Victoria cleared her throat. Robert, she's technically correct. The look he gave her could have melted steel. This was the first crack the moment Victoria realized that sleeping with the CEO didn't make her immune to corporate law. For the next hour, I listened to them plot damage control. Robert wanted to challenge the legitimacy of my purchases. Victoria suggested restructuring the company to dilute my shares. One board member, David Chen, who'd always been decent to me at company parties, quietly pointed out that any restructuring would require shareholder approval, which means Margaret would have to approve her own dilution. He said with barely concealed amusement when they reconvened the full meeting. Robert tried a different approach. Margaret, let's be reasonable. What will it take for you to sell your shares back to the company? I'm not interested in selling, I replied. I'm interested in participating. I helped build this company and now I intend to help run it. That afternoon, Victoria showed up at my apartment. I was expecting her. Desperate people always try the personal approach when the legal one fails. May I come in? She asked, all traces of her earlier arrogance replaced by careful politeness, of course. Coffee. We sat in my small living room, two women who'd been circling each other for months. Finally face to face without Robert as a buffer. This isn't going to bring him back, Victoria said without preamble. I laughed. Honey, I don't want him back. I want justice. What does justice look like to you? It looks like transparency, like honest accounting, like a company that serves its shareholders instead of funding personal vendettas and expensive divorces. Victoria set down her coffee cup. I love him, you know, I loved him too. For 38 years. But love doesn't excuse theft and it doesn't excuse humiliation. Robert says you're trying to ruin him. Robert ruined himself the moment he decided I was expendable. I'm just providing consequences. After Victoria left, I called Thomas. They're going to fight dirty. I told him, probably. But we have the law on our side and more importantly, we have the money. As long as you can maintain your stake, you control nearly a quarter of that company. That evening, I drove to my old house. I didn't plan to go inside. I just wanted to see Max and Bella. I parked across the street and waited. At 6 o'clock, Robert came home. At 6:15, I saw familiar golden shapes in the backyard. I got out of my car and whistled softly. Both dogs' heads snapped up. Max started barking immediately, that excited bark that meant family's home. Bella ran to the fence, whimpering and trying to push her nose through the slats. The back door slammed open, and Robert appeared. Get the hell away from my property. I'm on a public street, I called back. And those are my dogs. The divorce agreement says otherwise. The shareholder agreement says I have a lot of new rights. We should probably discuss that soon. I got back in my car and drove away. But not before I saw the look on Robert's face. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, he actually looked scared. Good. It was about time. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in corporate warfare. Robert hired extra lawyers to dig for loopholes in my stock purchases. Victoria billed the company $127,000 in shareholder dispute resolution fees. They even tried to call a special board meeting to vote me out until David Chen reminded them that removing a shareholder required cause, and being the ex-wife wasn't legally valid cause for anything. Meanwhile, I was uncovering just how deep Robert's financial misconduct really went. As a major shareholder, I had the right to examine the company books. What I found made my divorce settlement look like pocket change. Over the past 2 years, Robert used company funds to buy a $2.3 million corporate property in Martha's Vineyard, which he and Victoria used exclusively for vacations. He bought her a BMW under the executive vehicle allowance. He even expensed their couples therapy as executive counseling services, but the real surprise was Victoria's billing pattern. She had been charging the company for legal work that had absolutely nothing to do with Caldwell Industries immigration cases, personal injury suits, even divorce proceedings for other clients, all billed to Robert's company at premium corporate rates. This is fraud, Thomas said when I showed him the records. They've been using company resources to subsidize Victoria's entire practice. How much are we talking about over the last 18 months? Roughly $800,000 in questionable expenses. I stared at the numbers, feeling that familiar cold rage settle in my chest. While I'd been sleeping in a motel and begging for access to my own dogs, they had been stealing nearly $1 million from the company I helped build. Thomas, I want to call another board meeting. What's your agenda? Corporate accountability, financial transparency, and a motion to replace Robert as CEO. Margaret, even with your shares, you can't force that vote alone. I don't have to force it. I just need to present the evidence and let the other board members decide if they want to be accessories to embezzlement. The November board meeting looked nothing like October's. This time, I arrived with 3 boxes of documentation, a forensic accountant, and a full presentation on fiscal responsibility and shareholder value. Robert and Victoria sat at one end of the table like defendants at their own trial. The other board members looked more uncomfortable with every slide I showed. This Martha's Vineyard property, I said, clicking through photos, was purchased with company funds but used exclusively for personal vacations. The vehicle allowance for Ms. Sterling exceeds the CEO's own transportation budget. And these legal fees. I let the room go silent while they absorbed the numbers. Are you suggesting criminal activity? Asked Maria Santos, head of financial oversight. I'm suggesting a pattern of using corporate resources for personal benefit, without proper board approval or shareholder notification. Victoria finally spoke. These expenses were all properly categorized. By whom? I cut in. By the attorney who was billing for services she never provided. Robert slammed his hand on the table. This is harassment. You're using your position to wage a personal vendetta. I'm using my position to protect my investment. Something you should have been doing all along. David Chen leaned forward. Margaret, what exactly are you proposing? A full financial audit, immediate reimbursement of all personal expenses charged to the company, and new leadership oversight to make sure this never happens again. You want me removed as CEO? Robert asked flatly. I want you accountable as CEO. Whether you remain in that role depends on your willingness to accept proper oversight. The vote wasn't even close. 5-2 in favor of the financial audit. 4-3 in favor of creating a financial oversight committee with authority to review and approve executive expenses. He was elected chair of that committee unanimous, except for 2 predictable abstentions. After the meeting, Robert cornered me in the hallway. This isn't over, Margaret. You're right, I said. It's not. Because next month, I'm calling for a vote on CEO compensation packages. Did you know your salary has increased 340% in the past 5 years, while company profits have stayed flat? His face went white. You can't do this. Watch me. That evening, I had dinner at a small restaurant near my apartment. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your email. A friend, that was the text. The email had one attachment: a private investigator's report on Victoria Sterling's law practice. Apparently, someone else had been keeping tabs on my ex-husband's girlfriend, and they'd uncovered something very interesting. Victoria Sterling was under investigation by the State Bar Association for billing irregularities. Multiple clients had complained that she'd charged them for work that was never actually performed. Her law license was officially under review. I smiled and forwarded the email straight to Thomas. Robert thought he was being clever by aligning himself with a smart, ambitious attorney. In reality, he'd chosen a criminal. The State Bar investigation went public the following Monday. The Hartford Courant ran a front-page story, prominent attorney under investigation for billing fraud. Tuesday, 3 more clients had come forward with complaints. Robert's first instinct was to circle the wagons. It's a misunderstanding, he told the board during an emergency conference call. Victoria's practice is completely separate from Caldwell Industries, except for the $800,000 in questionable legal fees she billed our company, I said. That makes it very much our business. The board voted to suspend all payments to Victoria's firm until the investigation concluded. They also voted to hire an independent attorney to review every piece of work she had ever done for the company. Robert was furious but helpless. My 23.7% stake, combined with the increasing concerns of other board members, meant he couldn't push through a single decision without me, but Robert wasn't going down quietly. Thursday morning, I walked out of my building and immediately spotted a private investigator sitting in a car across the street. By afternoon, there were two. Robert was having me followed, hoping he'd find anything to discredit me or challenge my stock purchases. He wouldn't. There was nothing to find. But the stunt made one thing very clear: he was getting desperate. Friday afternoon, Victoria showed up at my apartment again. Only this time, she looked different, haggard, stressed. Her usual polished perfection nowhere in sight. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "About what?" "About Robert. About the company. About things you don't know." I let her in, more curious than anything else. "The bar investigation isn't going away," she said without even sitting down. "They're going to find irregularities because there are irregularities." Robert knew about them. That caught my attention. "What kind of irregularities?" "I've been using company funds to pay personal debts," her voice cracked. "Credit cards, my mortgage, even my daughter's college tuition. Robert approved all of it. Why are you telling me this?" Her composure finally broke. Tears started to form because he's throwing me under the bus. His new attorney is claiming I acted independently, that he knew nothing about the billing discrepancies. He's going to let me lose my license to save himself. I studied her face, watching for any hint of manipulation. She looked genuinely terrified. "What do you want from me, Victoria?" "Help," she whispered. "Testimony that Robert was involved in the financial decisions. And in return, I'll tell you everything about how he's been manipulating the company's finances." "Why should I trust you?" She wiped her tears, resigned. "Because I'm about to lose everything and you're the only person who has both the knowledge and the power to make this right." 2 hours later, I had enough evidence from Victoria to bury Robert's career permanently: offshore accounts, kickback schemes with contractors, a complex insurance fraud tied to the Martha's Vineyard property, and the final blow: he's planning to sell the company. She told me there's already a buyer lined up, some private equity firm. He was going to take the money and disappear, leave all the legal problems behind. When? January. The sale was supposed to go through after the holidays. I called Thomas immediately. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow. What's the agenda?" "CEO removal for cause, and freeze all executive compensation pending investigation." That evening, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, thinking about justice. It's a funny thing. You grow up believing good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior gets punished. But life teaches you that sometimes bad behavior just gets more creative. Still, if you're patient, smart, and very, very careful, justice has a way of finding its moment. Robert had made one fatal mistake after another, underestimating me, trusting Victoria completely, believing that money and power made him untouchable. Tomorrow, he'd learn just how wrong he was. The December board meeting was standing room only. Word had leaked about Victoria's cooperation. Robert arrived with his own attorney, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman from Hartford who specialized in executive defense. I arrived with Thomas, Victoria, and a box of evidence that would have made the FBI proud. "Before we begin," Robert's attorney said sharply, "I want to state for the record that my client denies all allegations and reserves the right to pursue legal action against anyone making false claims." "Noted," I replied calmly. "Now, let's discuss the evidence." For the next 3 hours, I took the board through Robert's financial misconduct in painstaking detail: the offshore accounts Victoria had helped him set up, the contractor kickbacks that had inflated project costs by 25%, and the insurance claim for storm damage at the Martha's Vineyard property that had actually been caused by a drunken party. Not weather, but the real bombshell was the planned sale of the company. Robert has been negotiating with Pinnacle Investment Group to sell Caldwell Industries for $14 million, I announced. He intended to complete the sale without notifying shareholders or board members, taking an $8.4 million payout from his 60% stake. The room exploded. David Chen demanded documentation. Maria Santos wanted to know why the board had never been informed. Even Robert's attorney blinked, stunned. "That's completely legal," Robert said, but his voice trembled. "I have majority ownership." "You do," I agreed. "But you also have fiduciary responsibility to all shareholders." Selling the company in secret while under investigation for financial misconduct could easily be considered fraud. Thomas rose. "I'd like to call for a vote of no confidence in Robert Caldwell as CEO." Seconded. David Chen said immediately. The vote was 6-1. Only Robert voted to keep Robert. "I'd also like to nominate Margaret Smith as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership." Thomas continued. That vote came in at 5-2, with Robert and one other member dissenting, and just like that, I went from divorced housewife to the interim CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation. But then came the real shock. As the meeting began to wrap up, Victoria stood. There's something else you all need to know about the planned sale, she said. Robert's face drained of color. Victoria, don't. Pinnacle Investment Group isn't who they claim to be, she continued. It's a shell company. Robert wasn't selling to outside investors. He was selling to himself. A long, heavy silence followed. The plan was to buy the company back at a massive discount after it was stripped of assets. She added, then rebuild it without any of the original shareholders. That's securities fraud, Maria whispered. That's embezzlement, David Chen corrected. And conspiracy, someone else muttered. Robert lurched to his feet so fast his chair toppled. This meeting is over actually, I said, checking my notes as interim CEO. I'm calling for an immediate forensic audit of all company accounts, a freeze on all executive assets, and a formal report to the SEC regarding potential fraud. Robert glared at me with pure hatred. You've destroyed everything, Margaret. 38 years of building this company and you've destroyed it for revenge. I've saved it, I corrected. From you, he stormed out, his attorney scrambling after him, leaving behind a trail of threats that only made him look more desperate. Victoria approached me quietly. Thank you, don't thank me yet, I said. You're still facing disbarment. Possibly criminal charges, I know, she whispered. But at least now, the truth is out. That evening, I sat alone in my small apartment, now the interim CEO of a $14 million company, holding evidence that could send my ex-husband to prison. My phone buzzed. Heard about the board meeting. Proud of you. Max and Bella's dog Walkery smiled. Someone was watching out for my dogs. And someone else wanted me to know they were safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges running a company, dealing with investigations, fielding more legal threats from Robert. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like Margaret Caldwell again. Not the discarded ex-wife. Not the homeless woman sleeping in a motel. But the woman who helped build something worth protecting. Justice, I realized, was even sweeter than revenge. 6 months later, I sat in the CEO's office reviewing quarterly reports showing a 23% increase in profitability since Robert's departure. Turns out that when you stop using company funds to subsidize executive vacations and fraudulent legal fees, the bottom line improves dramatically. The SEC investigation concluded with Robert paying $2.3 million in fines and accepting a lifetime ban from serving as a corporate officer. Victoria lost her law license, but avoided prison thanks to full cooperation with prosecutors. The Martha's Vineyard property had been sold, with proceeds returned to the company, but the best part of every day came at 5:30 p.m. My assistant knocked gently on my office door. Your visitors are here. Miss Caldwell. Max and Bella exploded into the room like furry rockets, nearly tackling me with joy. Behind them walked David Chen, now the company's board chairman, who had personally driven to my old house to retrieve Max and Bella the day Robert moved out. How are my best executives? I asked, scratching behind Max's ears while Bella tried to wriggle into my lap. They missed you, David said. The whole neighborhood knew they weren't where they belonged. Getting my dogs back had required one final legal maneuver. As interim CEO, I'd instituted a policy banning personal use of corporate assets, including pets, that had been wrongly labeled as company property. Robert's new attorney had fought it, of course. But after months of legal bills and mounting evidence of his misconduct, he finally caved. Now Max and Bella came to work with me every day. They had matching beds in my office and had become beloved company mascots. Employees stopped by with treats. They appeared in our holiday card. And HR politely reminded me that dogs technically weren't allowed at board meetings, unless they were mine. My phone buzzed. Thomas, final settlement update, he said. Roberts agreed to all terms. Full restitution of the questionable expenses, transfer of his remaining shares to set up the employee stock ownership program, and he'll issue a formal apology to be published in the Hartford Courant. And the house? I asked. Yours, if you want it. Victoria moved out last month. I looked around my office, then down at Max and Bella, now snoring softly after the excitement of their reunion. I think I'll pass, I said. Too many memories. But I know someone who might want to buy it. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party in my apartment for the people who had helped me rebuild my life. Thomas and his wife David Chen and his partner, my sister Joyce, who'd flown in from Florida. So Joyce said over dessert, what's next for the new CEO? I raised my wine glass. I actually have an announcement. Everyone looked up. I'm stepping down as CEO next month. The room erupted in confusion. Don't panic, I laughed. I'm not leaving the company. I'm becoming chairman of the board and hiring a real CEO, someone younger, with fresh ideas and preferably someone who understands Excel better than a 63-year-old who just discovered pivot tables. What will you do with all your extra time? Thomas asked. I scratched Max behind the ears and smiled. I'm thinking about getting married again. The room fell silent. His name is Frank, I said. He's the bank supervisor who helped me uncover Grandpa Henry's old account. Divorced 3 years, 2 grandkids, and he makes the best coffee I've ever tasted. Joyce wiped away tears. Oh, Maggie, you deserve this. As everyone toasted, I thought about the last 18 months. I'd gone from crying in a motel room to sitting here surrounded by people who valued me, running a company I'd helped build, and planning a future with someone who saw me as an equal, not an accessory. Robert had tried to erase me, to reduce 38 years of marriage to a footnote in his story. Instead, he'd handed me the greatest gift, the chance to discover who Margaret Caldwell was when she wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed again. Frank, dinner tomorrow? I found a new apple pie recipe that might change your life. I smiled and typed back, my life's already changed, but I'd love the pie. Max lifted his head, giving me the soulful golden retriever look that always made my heart melt. Yes, I whispered to him. We're all going to be just fine. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize you never needed it in the first place. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. And sometimes if you're patient and brave, the universe gives you exactly what you deserve, even if it takes 63 years and a grandfather's $50 investment to get there.